Hi everyone, Kurant here, and welcome to part 4 of my cancer story. Last time, we essentially talked about all the process leading up to the beginnings of my chemotherapy. And today, we're going to talk about my chemotherapy. Yay! Sorry, but I've got my glasses, my readers, because I need to read a couple of things, in essence, in terms of talking about chemotherapy and the chemotherapy that I was receiving. So yeah, I've got my readers to be able to read those. Otherwise, I'd be slightly, well, actually, it wouldn't be too bad. But yeah, still, I need readers anyway. So before I get to describing the chemotherapy in detail, though, I do want to sort of introduce it, of course. I started chemotherapy in late August 21st to be precise. It was a Friday. All of my chemos were on Fridays. In essence, they scheduled them accordingly because a lot of patients, they said, liked to have the weekend to recover before they needed to get back to doing whatever, essentially. Part of my preparation for chemo was getting a leave of absence from work, and so I didn't have to worry about working my retail job on the weekends because I was on a leave of absence until December. Also, part of what I failed to mention in terms of chemo prep was because we knew well enough in advance that I was going to have chemo, and because we knew that I was going to be out of class, out of my teaching, I had time to be able to record all of my lectures, like basically what I'm doing here, except I have PowerPoints instead of my face. I think the students probably liked the PowerPoints better. But anyway, so I had all that recorded, so I had it ready to go. So I was fortunate, again, to stress a common theme here, I was fortunate in that I was able to prepare. I had the time to prepare that. And so I had a leave of absence from work, and I also was ready to go in terms of my teaching for the semester, even though I had to walk up to my students in the first day of class and go, "Hi, I'm going to have chemo starting on Friday, so we're not going to see each other for a while." So yeah. Anyway, so as they were getting me ready for chemo, they, of course, were making preparations accordingly in terms of the medicine and other things. Essentially, every day, every time that I went in to have chemo, they took blood work before anything happened. And they will always do that because they take various markers. They will check your red blood cell counts, your white blood cell counts, and various other things that I will admit I've kind of forgotten, some of them at least. But they would check all those numbers before they put anything in you, because if you haven't recovered sufficiently from a previous chemo session, or if your numbers are down for various other reasons, they're not going to do it, period. They will slam them brakes faster than you can blink, because they don't want you getting sick. Sick beyond what can be controlled or what can be anticipated, but they don't want you getting into a life-threatening situation because of chemotherapy that could be prevented. So whenever we were getting in and getting ready, they took blood and they did measurements and stuff all the time to make sure that everything was good to go. As far as the chemo itself, in terms of it was always an early morning thing. The chemo always started at 8 a.m. And for my first time, it was, like I said, August 21st, 8 a.m. So I get ready. My mom had come into town to essentially keep me company for the weekend because chemo can knock you out and you need other people there to help you, unless you're really, really good at healing and recovery. And then in that case, well, congratulations, you can join Wolverine in that camp. But anyway, so Mom was there to drive me around, to get groceries and things like that, and to clean my apartment, as it turned out. It was a lot of what she did that first day. And to essentially keep me company for the weekend, just in case anything came up. So she was there, and so we went and got breakfast that morning, because unlike other treatments or drugs, or especially with surgery, they don't want you eating the day before, until after like 10 o'clock the night before. They don't want you drinking anything after 10 o'clock the night before. because they're going to knock you out. They don't want you reacting badly to those chemicals, puking and choking on your puke, basically. But with chemotherapy, they want you eating before you come in because you're going to be there a while. So Mom's there. We go to get breakfast. I forget where exactly, but we got breakfast, and then we went over to the cancer center. 8 o'clock, they had everything ready to go. So basically, getting chemotherapy, over the last couple of decades or so has improved drastically from my understanding. It is leagues better than it used to be in terms of the process, in terms of comfort level, in terms of the treatment, in terms of side effects, in terms of everything, really. So we go into the infusion bay, which is what they called it. They had, I think, 3 or 4 different separate bays where they had all these chairs, basically recliners, except not quite, but pretty much. Essentially, they had these recliners spaced around the room, and they were spaced perfectly fine as far as social distancing and stuff, so don't worry, everything was good. So they had them spaced apart. They had them, to where people were in good condition on that front. But they had all these chairs in probably at least 3 different rooms. I only ever went to the first one because that was where my chemo nurse was. So they had all these rooms where you would go and you would sit in the chair, and that would essentially be it. That would be about all you had to do, really. And so essentially how it went was I go in there. Mom couldn't go with me because of COVID restrictions, which sucked, but I understood it. There were folks who did have people who came in with them, but those were folks who needed other people around them for mobility, for really tough cases. I wasn't that tough. I'm just like, yeah, I'm good. I don't have to worry about it. So I go in, and Miss Christie was my chemo nurse, and she was my chemo nurse for the whole time, all 6 sessions. And I liked that. They kept you with the same person the whole time. They didn't switch everybody around on you. You had the same person who knew your predilections, your tendencies, what you liked to do and didn't like, or the whole time. So Miss Christie was getting everything ready. And so the way that chemotherapy essentially works with port, with my port, my lovely little bump here, is they get you sat, they get you comfy. If you need a blanket, they give you a blanket. And you need water or whatever, they give you that. They get you ready. And then essentially what they do is they poke you open. The whole idea with the port, I don't know if y'all can see it on camera. You may not be able to because the camera's a little too far away. But on the port, there are these 3 bumps arranged in a triangle. That's intentional because that's there to tell the nurse, hey, the port hole, basically, where they stick the needles and everything, is right at the meeting point of those, kind of in between all 3 of those dots, so that the nurse can go, okay, and get it right the first time. So you come in and they check your port. They inject essentially saline into it to clean it out, to make sure that it's clean, because the port goes straight into your vein, and it's of course supposed to deliver the chemo drugs right into you. So if it's not cleaned out, you're in trouble. So they poked me and they cleaned it out, make sure everything's cleaned out. And it's kind of funny because the way that the port is, one of the things that was just a general impression from the chemotherapy is you could actually taste the chemotherapy. You could taste some of the chemicals. It is so weird. For instance, you could taste the saline. I could taste the saline whenever they were pumping it into me. It was a weird feeling whenever they were pumping some of the other drugs into me. I could feel them going into me. And it was bizarre. It was kind of neat, actually, in a way, in a weird little twisted way, I guess. But it was still a little bizarre. So anyway, they clean me out, make sure everything's good to go. And when they do chemo, they don't start immediately going, okay, well, let's pump you full of all these, radioactive chemicals, because that's bad. largely because those radioactive chemicals are very nauseating. They will tear your stomach to flippin' shreds if you don't get your drugs accordingly. So what they start you out with is 2 or 3 different anti-nausea drugs, and these drugs are pretty good. This is one of the things that's really developed in the last couple of decades or so in terms of chemotherapy treatment is anti-nausea, because nausea is one of the big side effects of chemotherapy. They pump so much into you that your stomach is basically a lead block for a while, and at least it feels like it anyway. And so it gets, your body kind of wants to upchuck a bit. But these nausea meds that they give you, and like I said, they give you a couple of different types, are really good. Throughout my entire chemo process, I didn't puke once. Not once. My stomach felt like a lead block for a good while, granted, but I never puked because of the drugs. So they start out with these anti-nausea drugs. And when we went in, or when we were getting ready to go in, they said, okay, give it probably 3 to 4 hours, considering all the chemo that he's going to be getting and so on and so forth. Turns out it's more like 5, which wasn't too big of a deal, really. It was just mostly mom texting me going, hey, are you done yet? No. So they give me the anti-nausea drugs first to get things started, ready to go. So then, after the anti-nausea drugs have had some time to set in, excuse me, this is probably about, let's see, if chemo started if the session itself started at 8, they clean out my port and get me ready, you're probably talking about 9:30, 10 o'clock is when they started with the actual drugs, with the actual chemotherapy. Actually, no, hang on, let me back up. It's not 10 o'clock, it's probably closer to 11, because they take your blood and then they have to wait an hour for all of that to process, to get the results to make sure you're good to go. Then they start you on the anti-nausea drugs. Okay, sorry. So probably about 9 o'clock, 9:30, I started getting the nausea drugs, and then probably about 10:30-ish, 10:30, 11 o'clock, they start me on the actual chemo meds. And there were 4 different chemo meds that I took. In acronym, it's ABVD, which is a reasonably aggressive chemotherapy treatment. It wasn't the most aggressive that you could have. I think there's another one called BCOP, which I believe is BEACOPP. I don't know that for certain. I didn't really look too much into BCOP because I never got it, so I don't have the information on hand. But I do have the information for ABVD, which is why I brought the readers, because I can't quite read these names up close because of my lens. So the first drug, the A drug, is doxorubicin. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, there's no A there. Correct, doxorubicin is the generic name for the drug adriamycin, so A. That was about 15 minutes of infusion. Not too bad. It was, although it was the one that I most easily remember because the doxorubicin or adriamycin was what they colloquially called the Red Devil. And they called it that because A, it was red, but it was the drug that you could most easily see a result, at least sometime afterward, visibly, because it turned your pee red. So, and it was the one drug, the one chemo drug that you had to, if you needed to take a leak, essentially, you had to go before you started. You couldn't move, you couldn't go anywhere while you were taking that infusion. The other 3, you could move around if you needed to. You could go to the bathroom if you needed to, what have you. But for that one, that specific first one, you had to make sure that everything was good to go before you started. So adriamycin or doxorubicin was the first one, about 15-minute infusion. Then after that, you had a short time to rest and to recover. I'll also add, as a little bit of a side note on all this, part of the reason why it took 5 hours or so to get the chemo in me and all that was not just because of the blood work and the anti-nausea drugs, but it was also because I wasn't the only one getting chemotherapy, of course. So they had, Miss Christie was the main chemo nurse for her bay, I suppose. And so she was doing stuff for 3 or 4 different patients sometimes at a time. So that was part of the wait too. Every time that they actually got the chemotherapy ready, when they were actually going to infuse the medicine itself, they always had a chemo buddy. Always had somebody else come along to make sure that everything was going fine, that the infusion process was working well, and that the medical information was right, that they were giving the right person the right drugs. In other words, they wanted to have somebody else there as a backup, just in case, things went awry or whatever. Fortunately, that was never the case for me or anybody else that I was aware of, but it was still nice to have that backup there just in case. Okay, so anyway, sorry, I'm getting myself a little distracted. So I have the adriamycin first. That's the red devil, and 15 minutes, and then we wait a little bit with A, for it to make sure it gets through me, and B, because they've got to work with other people. Then the second one, and I don't have to look at the names for this, was bleomycin. The B part, obviously, of ABVD. This one is interesting because the biggest, I wouldn't really say side effect per se, but the biggest qualification that came with bleomycin and comes with bleomycin is that if I ever want to go deep sea diving, I will have to talk to a respiratory physician and essentially talk with my cancer folks before I do that, because bleomycin, for whatever reason, affects your respiratory functions, and so it's most impacted particularly in deep sea diving, and I don't know the science behind it, so I won't try to drone on too much. But they were telling me in terms of getting ready that, hey, if you ever deep sea dive, you need to get a doctor to take a look at you first to make sure you can do that. So there's that. Bleomycin was, I think, 10 minutes. Let me make sure here. I believe bleomycin was 10. Yeah, bleomycin was 10 minutes. So of the 4 chemo drugs that I got, that was the shortest in terms of just straight out infusion. That was most of them were relatively quick. So that was 10 minutes, and then again, the usual break time, make sure I'm ready, make sure everybody else is ready, etc., etc. Then the third one is honestly the one that I don't remember. Let's see. Okay, so the third one was the vinblastine. That was also 15 minutes. That was also, pretty standard as far as it went. But again, relatively short, not too big a deal, really. The fourth one was the one that was a bit of a doozy. The fourth one, oh darn, I can't quite read that without the glasses, sorry. The fourth one was dacarbazine, the D in the ABVD. That one was an hour. That was by far the longest. In fact, that was a longer infusion than the other 3 combined. And that was essentially, whenever I started getting the dacarbazine was whenever I would text Mom and say, hey, I just started the D, the dacarbazine, so time to come get me. Because as I mentioned, Mom couldn't come in with me. Mom couldn't stay there because of COVID regulations. So that's the drugs in a nutshell. Now, I guess, kind of describing a little bit of what it was like to get them and sort of be in the facility and what have you. Like I said, the facility was nice. The chemo bay, or the infusion bay, was comfortable. They put you in a recliner, and pretty much that's all you did for the next 5 hours-ish, depending on how long it took. They encouraged you strongly to have something to do. Something to read, something to watch, talking to people, whatever. Something to keep you occupied, because otherwise you were going to get bored off your butt. Some people even slept during chemotherapy. I don't think I ever did that. I don't remember doing that anyway. But what I did to entertain myself during chemo, I kind of alternated. Sometimes I brought my laptop and I would either watch people on Twitch, or I would actually do randomizers while I was sitting there taking chemotherapy. And it was a little weird because they've got, wires in you because you got things hooked up to you via the port, and then you got to sit here and hold a controller and try to do things. It was kind of weird, but I pulled it off occasionally. I think it was about that time that I was in the middle of the Final Fantasy IV Free Enterprise, the Highway to the Threemus Zone tournament, so I was practicing Free Enterprise, and I still sucked, but I was still practicing that. And then sometimes I would bring a book that I would read, just depending. I think it was at that time that... Let's see, I think it was at that time that one of Jim Butcher's books had come out. I think it was, at that point, it was Battleground, was his latest book. I think that had come out. And so I was reading that. And so, in other words, I did various things. I watched people, I played games, I read books. And I think if COVID had not been a thing, I probably would have talked with some of the other folks in the Chemo Bay a bit more. But we were distant enough, like literally physically distant enough, that it kind of created a sense of sort of isolation. Well, not isolation, but a little bit more social distance in the literal sense of the word or term. So I didn't really get to know other people who were getting chemotherapy. I think another part of that was I was the youngest patient in the infusion bay by something like 20 years. Something like that. Because I was 38 when I started taking chemotherapy, or well, actually the whole time. And the people that were typically in there were probably in their 60s, 70s, 80s. I think there's one guy that might have been in his 50s, but it's hard to tell. So the patients were typically a lot older than I was, so kind of not a lot of common ground there, especially when they see me going while I'm doing chemo. So anyway, I get the chemo, and like I said, I'm playing games, I'm watching Twitch, I'm reading, I'm texting people, on occasion, mostly mom, but texting other folks. And so that was essentially the experience in terms of what I did, aka not much. As for how I felt, it's hard to encapsulate precisely because it was on and off sorts of things. Because sometimes, some of the sessions I got chemo and I responded just fine, and some sessions I didn't. It just kind of depended. But mostly what I remember feeling is nausea. There was a lot of nausea involved. I mean, like I said, my stomach felt like a lead weight for a while. Fortunately, again, didn't upchuck anything, but it still felt kind of crappy. Fatigue was a big thing during and after chemo, because the whole idea, the whole thing, how chemo works is, according to some of the stuff that I was reading in my packet, chemotherapy goes after rapidly dividing cells, which is one of the big hallmarks of cancer, is it rapidly develops and spreads. But the problem is red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets do too. So it guts those as well, which is why they keep such tabs on all your blood counts to make sure that things are going okay. What that meant was fatigue. Even though I was quite literally sitting on my butt for 5 hours, doing as much and nothing as possible, I was still getting tired because that's what the chemo was doing to me. So fatigue was part of it too. Although, admittedly, the fatigue wasn't really as bad during chemo and in the first roughly day after, because another thing that they gave you was steroids as the lead-in. Now, you might be thinking, oh, so why don't you look like a big burly baseball player now? Because that's not what steroids do. Steroids don't pump up your muscles. Steroids heal you. And they allow you to work out more and work out harder because your body heals a lot faster than it would normally do. That's why steroids was a big deal with baseball, because guys would take them and it wouldn't just magically go, but instead their muscles would heal much faster than normal, and so they would be in the gym every day working out like, their life freaking depended on it. And that's why they got the big old muscles and stuff, because that's what steroids do, is they heal you and they heal the tears in your muscle from working out, and so they allow you to keep working out more and more and more. What steroids did for me was keeping me going, because the anti-nausea drugs and steroids meant that I felt pretty decent coming out of chemo most of the time. No, I was nauseated, a little tired, but not too bad. Let's see, other things about the infusion itself. Another thing I remember, and this is not to cast aspersions on anything, it's just kind of how things worked out, was the food. Because they would come around, they would bring food and water and stuff like that for you to drink to help you through that. Because, like I said, you're there for hours, so you're going to get peckish. So I would get food and drinks from the food folks. I started eventually bringing my own food because I found it, one specific instance that comes to mind is I got some sort of a wrap, and I don't remember what kind of a wrap it was. I don't know who made it, so I don't want to cast, like I said, I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody, but I eat this wrap, some sort of chicken wrap, I guess, and it was the most tasteless thing I've ever had in my life. Like, it felt like biting into solid nothingness. And it was so bad, and I remember it so vividly because it was in the middle of the chemotherapy treatment, that I still kind of have lingering issues eating wraps, like a hero or something like that. If it's just straight, like a cold wrap, if it's not warmed up or anything like that, I still have issues eating it. I don't know, sounds weird, but it's just one thing that stuck with me. So I started bringing my own food, mostly Nature Valley sweet and salty almond bars, which I kind of got tired of them too because they became chemo food, and so I associated them with that for a while. But one thing, speaking of food, one thing that I did found to be really nice in terms of food was actually drink. Something I didn't drink very often and had not actually, well, let me back up slightly. Up until I started taking my chemotherapy treatments, I had not had a carbonated beverage since 2008. It was one of the things I gave up when I started getting in shape, and it's one of the things I missed the least about not being in shape. Because I used to drink Cokes like it was going out of style. Now I can't stand the thought of it even. So I had not had a carbonated beverage at this point in 12 and a half years. But then they're going, okay, so hey, ginger ale will help in terms of the nausea. I'm like, do I have to? No, but it'll be helpful. Okay, so I get ginger ale and I start drinking it. And I didn't guzzle it, I just sipped it. But it did help. It really helped a lot. So much, in fact, that Mom got a whole box, like a whole pack of ginger ale, put it in the fridge, and I would just keep sipping on the stuff during, especially the weekend after chemo, because I needed it to help kind of tamp down the nausea. So ginger ale really helped. That was kudos to that. So I guess really overall the chemotherapy session itself wasn't bad. I mean, it was long, it was kind of boring at times, but the nurses fortunately were nice and interactive and etc. So that helped. And if you felt like the drugs were really getting to you, as I would at certain points, and they would give you more anti-nausea stuff just to keep everything under control, and it generally worked pretty well. So 5 hours later-ish, we get done with the chemo. Mom comes, picks me up, we go home, and really for that weekend the plan was pretty much rest. That was it. Now they did say, one of the things that they said in Chemo 101 was make sure that you stay active. Not like all the time, but that you don't just completely go potato, because that actually makes things worse. And I admit, I probably should have been a little bit more active during chemo in terms of getting up, walking around, going places. Admittedly, though, on the other side of the coin, part of the reason why I wasn't all that active is because I live on the 3rd floor of a 3-floor apartment complex, and the stairs I have are steep and narrow. Yeah, it's not ADA compliant, just in case anybody's curious. So I had to temper my activity against that there was a very real possibility, especially in the days immediately after chemo, that if I went down those 2 flights of stairs and walked around, even if it's just walking around the apartment complex, which is small, there was the possibility that I might not make it back up the stairs. At least make it back up them very quickly. So I was not as active as I should have been coming out of chemotherapy. But also at the same time, they told you, hey, stay active, but don't push yourself. And they would have put that in all caps, bold, underlined, 90-point font if they could. Don't push yourself. Because ultimately everybody responds a little bit differently to chemotherapy. They give you a long freaking list of potential side effects that range from anything from nausea, fatigue, hair loss, to loss of limbs, mostly if you do IV, and other such things. Mouth sores, hair, bone aches, I mentioned nausea, all sorts of things. Fatigue being a big one, fatigue being a constant one pretty much. So there's all sorts of side effects, and everybody responds a little differently. So that's why they really pushed the idea, don't push yourself. Know your limits. When you feel yourself starting to reach your limit, stop. As in, throw down the brakes, screech to a halt, stop. Have someone else there to help you if you need help. And that's why Mom was down there for the first treatment, because I didn't know what to expect. And so I needed her help. It certainly didn't hurt that Mom's the medical professional in the family, so she could look at the blood work and go, oh, okay, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'll just look at it and go, what? And she could interpret all the medical jargon to something that I could actually understand. So I go home, and the weekend essentially was, well, Friday I was all jazzed up because I was on steroids. Saturday I was kind of jazzed up because I was still largely on steroids. Sunday was the crash. Sunday was almost inevitably the crash because the steroids wore off. All the peppy drugs that they give you were gone, and it's just, and I slept most of Sunday pretty much. That was usually when Mom would go home, was Sunday, because I could feel the crash starting to hit. Like my body was just sinking into my chair, and I'm like, okay, I'm about to sleep for a while now. And so that's usually when she would go home, because at that point it was just pretty much, I didn't really need a lot of oversight at that point. It was just, she was just literally going to watch me sleep. Fortunately, while I was in chemo, she was able to get work done, and actually get work done right here, literally at this desk where I'm sitting right now, which is where I do all my broadcasts and recordings and everything. She would sit here and get work done. So that was good. So really what the weekend consisted of was just sitting around, mostly walking around when I needed to, obviously for restroom and stuff like that. We ordered in a fair bit of food because I certainly wasn't going anywhere, and Mom didn't want to leave me, so we either picked up a bunch of food at the grocery store or we ordered out. First time I'd ever used services like DoorDash and Grubhub, by the way. So the weekend went, decently. After the steroids stopped working, I slept a lot because fatigue, like I said, one of the big issues. The other big issue was nausea, and of course, and they give you a whole gob of drugs to take to keep the nausea down after you leave chemo, and I was taking those as I was ordered to do, as I was supposed to do, because I didn't want to have any problems. The other biggest thing that really came with the post-chemo was hiccups. Lots and lots of hiccups. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, what? Hiccups? Yeah, was not listed on any of the side effects of anything that I had or anything that I was taking, and yet, typically on Friday evening or Saturday evening, I would just erupt into hiccups, constant hiccups. Combine that with the fact that your stomach is ripped to shreds from the fact that you got a bunch of chemo drugs running through your body, equaled some really painful reflux. Like, to the point that I was literally crying. It was so bad. And I felt bad, especially for Mom, because Mom could literally do nothing about it. She gave me water, she gave me, one of the things we got was a lot of ice cream and stuff like that because of the mouth. I didn't really have mouth sores, but my mouth heated up a lot. She gave me that, and it didn't help. I mean, I even got, gave me sugar, stand and lean forward and drink water upside down, all the, home remedies. None of them worked. Just on and on and on. It kept me up at night. It was probably one of the reasons I was so fatigued after the first couple of treatments, was because I couldn't get good sleep because I was hiccuping all night. So we were desperate after a while, after really the second treatment. We were desperate, trying to figure out what the heck was going on. So one night I wake up and I'm hic. And I do something that I usually would never recommend doing, and that is Googling it. When it comes to medical stuff, I don't recommend consulting Dr. Google, because who knows what Dr. Google will tell you. But fortunately, this time, I found actual published legitimate medical studies saying, hey, the reason you're hiccuping after chemo is because of one of the steroid drugs you're taking for post-chemo. And it turns out it was true. It was the dexamethasone that I was taking in the morning as a steroid. It was giving me hiccups at night. And so I mentioned it to Mom, and we talked about it with Dr. Hull. And they're like, okay, fine, we'll figure something else out. So I stopped taking it, and the hiccups, gone. Just like that. That's it. And that was really the worst thing that I had to deal with, because like I said, that probably contributed to the fatigue, made me feel like crap, literally and figuratively. And fortunately, that was resolved and everything was, well, I say good to go, but relatively speaking. So that essentially was that. And I think that's actually where I'm going to end this episode, because next time on my cancer story, we're going to do kind of a really squishy sort of episode, because we're going to be squishing 12 weeks of chemotherapy treatments into one episode. I'm just going to talk in a very sort of general sense about what it was like to have chemotherapy for 3 months straight. Well, not straight, but 3 months. What it was like to get it having all that during COVID, and kind of what was generally going on, both in my sort of IRL physical space and here online too. So thank you guys, as always, appreciate it. Thank all of y'all who've been watching, who've been leaving comments. I very much appreciate it. It has helped make me feel like this is really worth it, I guess. But yeah, so thank you guys, have a good one, and hopefully I will see y'all next time.